Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first Startup Global webinar of 2026, Navigating Interprovincial Trade in Canada. My name is Amanda Logan. I am the Programs Officer for Startup Global here at Startup Canada. To begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which I am today is located on the unceded and traditional territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, also known as Ottawa. As we are a national organization, I would also like to acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples. I encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory you're residing on today. We invite all of our attendees to introduce themselves and connect with each other in the chat. Make sure you are sending your messages to everyone in the room. You are welcome to share your LinkedIn or your business social media pages, but please note you are in no way obligated to share any personal information. Please only share information that you are comfortable with being public. So to start us off, a bit about Startup Canada. Startup Canada is a national nonprofit that is the gateway to Canada's entrepreneurial ecosystem. We are here to connect entrepreneurs with the support, community, and tools they need to build a successful business in Canada. Startup Global is one of Startup Canada's flagship programs that supports entrepreneurs looking to export and expand their businesses internationally, or in today's case, interprovincially. From webinars, roundtables, and our annual pitch competition, this free program will help you build an international market entry strategy and plan. I would like to take a moment to thank our co-presenting partners, UPS and Export Development Canada, also known as EDC, as well as our ecosystem partner Forum for International Trade Training, and our community partners, GS1, Communitech, and WeBC. Now we have a quick video from our partner UPS on how they can support Canadian small businesses and entrepreneurs. Thank you so much, UPS. Today's conversation is focused on helping entrepreneurs fine-tune their business in Canada's diverse and vibrant economy before expanding coast to coast to coast. We'll walk through the roadmap for scaling across the country, including an overview of Canada's internal market, guidance on navigating interprovincial barriers, key tax considerations, and other resources to support your expansion across provincial lines. We do have prepared questions for our panelists. However, if you do have a question, please write it in our Q&A box on the bottom function, the bar on the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer it live. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our speakers today. We are joined by Joshua Council, co-founder and director of brand and business development with Good Robot Brewing Company and the Beverage Factory. We're joined by Michael Hoer, export advisor with Export Navigator. Narissa Allen, food safety and border systems strategist with Narissa Allen Consulting and the Black Businesses Association of BC. And we're joined by Ryan Toulouseau, senior advisor from the Privy Council office. So to start us off, I'm going to pass it over to Ryan, who's going to give us a little bit of an update and a brief as to where Canada is with interprovincial trade. And then I will pass it to the rest of our panelists to introduce themselves and their story. So Ryan, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Amanda. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Toulouseau. I'm a senior advisor at the Privy Council office, which is a small but mighty federal government department that supports the Prime Minister, Cabinet, and leads relations with provinces and territories. So I'll start with a short update on where federal, provincial, and territorial governments are going on removing interprovincial barriers to trade. I think it's important to note off the top, though, that trade within Canada is an essential driver of our economy. In 2024, more than $500 billion worth of goods and services moved across provincial and territorial borders, representing 17% of Canada's GDP. In the context of an uncertain global economy, strengthening the domestic market has never been more urgent. So a recent study suggests that we have a little bit more ways to go, and that removing all interprovincial trade barriers could add up to $210 billion a year to Canada's GDP. So roughly a 7% on top of that 17% that is already dedicated to domestic trade. Over the last year, federal, provincial, and territorial governments have worked together to really accelerate efforts to strengthen trade in Canada. All provinces have either passed or introduced legislation to remove barriers through mutual recognition, or they've entered into agreements with one another to facilitate internal trade in Canada. The federal government itself has passed and implemented the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act to build on these provincial efforts by removing federal barriers to the movement of goods, services, and labor. Governments are also strengthening interprovincial trade through collaborative efforts. So last year, all FPT governments signed the landmark Canadian Mutual Recognition Agreement, which is based on the principle that a good sold in one jurisdiction, based on the principle that a good sold in one jurisdiction may be lawfully sold in another without having to meet further requirements, with some exceptions. And last year, again, all federal, provincial, territorial governments signed an agreement on interprovincial trucking, which will reduce barriers in the trucking sector and facilitate the efficient movement of goods across the country. And finally, I think of interest to some on this panel, the provinces have signed an agreement to implement direct-to-consumer alcohol sales with a plan to have that system in place by May 2026. Looking forward, our work isn't finished. And so in January, First Ministers set the next phase of work for removing barriers. And they're targeting work in key sectors like food and agriculture, housing, and the movement of skilled workers. The federal government is also leading the creation of a domestic trade commissioners network to really help small and medium-sized businesses identify and access new domestic markets in Canada. So I'll pass it back to you, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Ryan. I appreciate that update, and I think it'll be great to dig into a lot of that in today's webinar. First, I'm going to pass it to Narissa. If Narissa, you'd love to tell us a little bit of your backstory in your business and what brought you into the world of food safety and border system strategy.
Certainly, and thank you, Amanda. Thanks for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with the group. So my name is Narissa Allen, and I work in food safety. And how I got here was I spent 20 years of my career working with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Started off as an inspector in a meat plant, moving into the airport where I worked on the line, basically, checking passengers as they would come in for food, plant, and animal restricted products, and then moving into the policy side of that. And from an import perspective, I worked as a food scientist, looking at processed products, manufactured goods, things of that nature. And then I moved to the national level where I worked with CFIA and CBSA when CBSA was created, to meld the regulations, but also to build that single window into the government to support brokers and importers in using the new digital systems for food, plant, and animal imports. From there, in 2021, I pivoted and I saw a need during COVID to support Black businesses in small business that were closing, and they needed business supports. And we started, my partner and I started the Black Business Association of BC, and that was really to help ourselves as small businesses, that we had a small business at the time, to navigate through COVID. And it ended up just blooming from there because so many people needed this help and support. And at the same time, I had started to, my plate was really full, and I had to make a decision on, am I going to continue to run our small business, work for the government, do the nonprofit? And I felt like I spent, I've given the government 20 years of my time and my effort, and I thought it was time to move on from there. And I pivoted after retiring from the government. I moved into consulting and supporting businesses in a more wholesome way, and that's where I am today, is supporting business through my consulting in navigating the legislative web that is CFIA regulations that can be a nightmare for some businesses.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing, Narissa. I'm excited to talk to you. I think um, the uh, the challenges with navigating all of that, I think you're going to have some great advice for our attendees today. Next, I'm going to pass it over to Michael to talk about his background and his work with Export Navigator.
Yeah, good afternoon and good morning, Canada. We are a big country and there's 4.5 or 5 time zones or so. Anyway, my name is Michael Huya. I'm an export advisor with the Export Navigator program in British Columbia. I'm based out of Nelson, and my region is the Kootenay boundary area, which is the southeast corner of BC. Right now, I'm in Calgary. Yeah, so I grew up in Europe, and as you can imagine, you learn a lot of languages, you move around because you drive 15 minutes one way, you're in a different country, you drive half an hour the other way, you're in a different country. So for me, international existence has been since day one. I had the pleasure to work in a number of corporate environments in Europe, the Middle East, and that included down in Bradstreet, Sheraton hotels. And then I fell in love with a Canadian, which brought me to Canada. Hence, I'm here. And so my beginnings here were actually with the Austrian consulate in Toronto and the Austrian Trade Commission, where inbound trade missions from Austria came to Canada. And I was blessed during that time to be able to match some of the visiting companies in Austria with counterparts and possible partners in the Ontario area mostly. And then after doing an MBA, an international MBA, I started with Magna in the automotive sector in Ontario. And so the majority of my time was spent in business development, getting contracts for new factories that needed to be built anywhere in Mexico, the US, or Canada at that time, or use existing capabilities and capacities and existing plans. 2006, we moved to BC. And at that time, the entrepreneurial bug bit me pretty hard. And it was after helping a European company turn around the US division that I assumed launched a business that was specialized in import and export of industrial machinery, especially for the recycling industries and bulk handling industries. And so we built this into quite a nice company over 9 years, serving customers across Canada, but also across the US for varying degrees, depending on the company that we imported, typically from Europe, some from New Zealand, some from Taiwan. We sold the company then, and 9 years ago is pretty much when I started my consulting coaching company here in Nelson, British Columbia. And for that time also I've been doing this export navigator work where I've helped about roughly 250 companies get into markets other than BC, whether it's within Canada or internationally. And it is a great joy at this point in time in my life to give back to entrepreneurs and help them avoid the costly mistakes that I was very keen on making at the time that I entered entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm so excited that you're joining from the perspective of someone who's been through these challenges themselves as an entrepreneur, and now you get to be an expert in the space and consult and navigate that for new entrepreneurs. Now, last but certainly not least, I'm going to pass it over to an incredibly successful entrepreneur themselves, based out of Halifax, Joshua Council.
Incredibly successful, according to who?
Me looking at your LinkedIn page.
Okay. Smoke and mirrors. Yeah, I love that segue, Michael. Speaking of costly mistakes entrepreneurs have made, my name is Joshua Council. I co-founded Good Robot Brewing in Halifax and also the Beverage Factory. My career started, I was the son of murder mystery dinner theater owners. Funny enough, Amanda, our host, actually worked for them in one of their shows about Game of Thrones. So I grew up in kind of an alternative, entrepreneur-oriented family in a very odd sector. Studied engineering because I thought I wanted to build rides at Disney World. It turned out engineering wasn't really for me, so I opened a brewery with my two drinking buddies, Angus and Doug. And what started as an 800 square foot garage brewery in Halifax in 2015 has grown into three award winning hospitality venues, beer gardens, and restaurants and stores. A B2B beverage co-packing facility. So that's literally where we take other people's liquids, such as non-alcoholic wine or energy drinks, and we put them into cans for them. So we manufacture and package other people's products that get exported across Canada and across the world. And we're also the fastest growing beverage brand in our category for the last 3 years straight. And we export across Atlantic Canada and have just dipped our toes into Alberta. So I'd also, by the way, I literally lived above the business for 4 years. This is my old living room that we converted into a bar. So thank you for joining me in my home today. Oh, and I wanted to give a quick shout out. I know EDC and UPS are putting this on. Monique Hash is our regional rep with EDC, and we literally would not have been able to grow our company without the TELP program, TELP, from EDC, a fabulous program, and Monique is a beast. She's awesome. And also UPS really saved our hides a few weeks back. Our filler machine that puts the non-alcoholic wine, energy drinks, juices into cans had a very rare piece that we needed urgently, and UPS was able to expedite it across the border. So shout out to our presenting sponsors. Thank you for saving our hides yet again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. Love the shout out to EDC and UPS. That's fantastic. A great example of how our partners can help. Um, Also, yes, rumors are true. I was once a murder mystery dinner theater actor, but if that's not an example of knowing when to pivot and ending up in new industries, there you go. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your stories and your background on, how you became an entrepreneur or how you became an expert in this space. To start us off for Michael, Narissa, and Josh, you have all worked across very different parts of the export and food business ecosystem. Um, I'm curious, and whoever feels the most passionate to start off, please feel free to answer. Where do you see the biggest gap, the thing that nobody is talking about right now, that is holding Canadian businesses back from scaling?
I can't see the other speakers, so I'll dive in, and I might be interrupting them. I apologize. I see it every week talking to entrepreneurs, maybe especially in Atlantic Canada, uh, which is risk. There's I think, a high degree of comfort in Canada of doing things a particular way, and exporting and growing a business is risky. And we as humans tend to be very risk averse. We like things to be safe and comfortable, and it's not. When you enter a new market, you have no brand awareness presence, which means you need to invest in marketing. Field of Dreams is a terrible lie. If you build it, they will not come. And also, your margin gets cut in half every time you go, a few hundred kilometers outside of where you produce. So financially, you're making pennies on the dollar, and you're putting forth a lot of marketing capital, which means it's kind of relegated to folks who are more inclined, I don't want to say more comfortable, but more inclined to take on a certain level of risk. So I think it's very much a psychological barrier.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that's a huge aspect of it. Um, Michael, what about yourself?
Yeah, you know what? I face this every day, but I do want to bring in a delineation, and that is the size of the company, because it boils down very often to capacity. But underlying that, some companies are just not ready, and the not so hyped and sexy, basics need to be addressed first. And that is bookkeeping, financial management, pricing for export, pricing for local conditions first. but that very often is in the way of having proper pricing for export markets because, as Josh just said, it gets expensive. There's partners involved. They all want to have a little bit of, the profits also, and so it's really important to have these basics addressed quick. And then really it's like management bandwidth is like the ability of a small, let's say a solopreneur to start detaching the persona from the business and going down the whole of the path of hiring staff, this key, and trusting them, delegating them, those kind of things. So nothing crazy. It's not rocket science, right? But it is a very important thing to take. Mid-sized companies, technology adoption, super, super important. Continuous innovation. We don't see enough of that. And we have incredible resources across Canada that help. And I think the final point I want to make, not so much of a gap, but perhaps even a gap, is that entrepreneurs don't tap into what's available. Don't walk it alone. There's so much support around. Take EDC, we just heard about sponsoring sponsored to this panel discussion. BDC, Expert Navigator, the list is endless. But you need somebody by your side that breaks it down and breaks it into digestible little step by step because it will take time. The resources are there. Don't walk it alone.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michael. And I think that's a fantastic call out there about how many resources do exist for entrepreneurs. I'll take this time to say that on our Startup Global website, we actually host a resource guide. It's a living document that has a bunch of resources for entrepreneurs in Canada. And so, I mean, that will be shared in the chat and then in a follow-up to our attendees of this webinar if that's if you're looking to find like a one-stop shop for where to find all of those resources. Lastly, Narissa, I'll pass it off to yourself. Is there a gap that you feel like should be talked a little bit more in Canadian business scaling?
Hmm. Yeah, I just want to touch on, operational interoperability across Canada. So, Ryan spoke earlier about, provinces and the federal government working together to try to break down the barriers and challenges with regards to policy and regulation and such. But there's still, in the space I'm in the food space, that to break those down and to marry those that's there's still a gap there, and I think he spoke to that's the next frontier where the government is looking to try to marry provincial and federal legislation. So even with federal progress, funders are still hitting friction where it comes to procurement rules and inspections and product testing, how logistics differ by province, but that creates a like hidden cost, right? So duplicate labels or tests and reapprovals or retraining. It slows time to market. So looking at a solution at the high level is one thing, but we really have to look at the execution harmonization and the mutual recognition in practice between the standardized checklist for the provinces versus what the federal government requires, and the service standards to make interprovincial sales feel more like you're shipping all in one country as opposed to you're shipping across 11 different countries. So I think one of the gaps that I would say would be, it's more not necessarily, well, it's about the policy, but it's also about the plumbing of how that under layer works to make sure that everything is seamless.
That's great. Thank you so much. Um, And thank you to all three of you for identifying, what gaps you see, and hopefully we can, try to solve or find some solutions to some of those as we chat today. Now I'm going to pass it over, Ryan. I have a question specifically for yourself. Um, you work at the center of federal, provincial, territorial negotiations on internal trade. For someone who might not follow policy closely, can you explain what the Privy Council office actually does in the internal trade space and why it matters to a business owner in this room?
Yeah, happy to. So the Privy Council Office, or PCO as we call it, is a small but mighty government department that supports the Prime Minister and Cabinet. It also leads federal efforts on some cross-cutting issues like removing interprovincial trade barriers, which is what my team focuses on. And so, really, the work we do is to coordinate federal efforts to remove the barriers we're talking about today, and also lead engagement with provinces and territories on collaborative work to remove barriers, as most of the barriers we hear about rest with the provinces and territories. So, we've led several initiatives over the past few years to really make progress on this issue. For one, we've implemented the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act, which leverages the principle of recognizing the rules of different provinces and territories to allow more goods, services, workers, and businesses to move freely across provincial borders. We've also removed all federal exceptions to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So, we have no more carve-outs from the rules of that extensive agreement, which sort of sets the rules for trade in Canada. And we've also launched the Canadian Internal Trade Data and Information Hub, which provides critical insights into the barriers and challenges that businesses face when doing business in Canada and across provincial borders. Finally, we've conducted extensive stakeholder and business engagement to really surface some of the most important barriers, which we like to think has informed some of the good work over the past year or so to remove them.
Great, thank you. I think your presence here is fantastic for entrepreneurs to feel like understanding policy is a little bit more accessible because it can be overwhelming at times, or maybe just an entirely new area, that an entrepreneur doesn't realize that's something that they do need to be exploring, right? Now, talking specifically about trading within Canada and working nationally. Um, for Josh, Michael, and Narissa, from for an early stage founder, why is interprovincial trade often a better first step when you begin to scale, rather than jumping straight into US or international markets?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Okay. I think it's because international trade is really your safest, cheapest, and your highest learning test market. Crossing provincial borders forces you to level up your operations, your forecasting, your quality control, compliance, which is what I do, your logistics without the added risk of, foreign currencies and tariffs and customs and USDA oversight and international freight costs and all of these other things, right? You get to scale, but you have guardrails. So I think because it builds credibility, that's really priceless. When international buyers and distributors hear that you are already shipping reliably across Canada, it's instantly more convincing than saying you only sell locally, and it shows traction. It shows stability. It shows you have a proven customer base, and you earn your export like experience and muscle in Canada, and it pays off when you are then looking to step into global markets. We've got businesses that are doing really well in Canada, and we've taken them on trade missions to Barbados, to South Africa, to Ghana, and being able to showcase that they are strong across Canada has really helped them in pushing forward discussions into landing opportunities and shelves outside of Canada.
I love that. You're creating a case study for yourself, right? You're creating
Mm.
proof when it comes time to export internationally. Josh or Michael, did either of you have anything to add to that?
Do you want to go ahead, Josh?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you basically nailed it, Narissa. It's uh, the smaller the sandbox, the more room there is or the less room there is to play in it, meaning the less mistakes you can make, the less stumbling around. Um, maybe you start at the farmer's market and you learn something about the quality of your product from getting consumer feedback at 7 in the morning from, senior citizens. and then you move to your own store, and then you move to maybe regional e-commerce or distribution at premium retail outlets. And every time you do, you learn a little bit more as soon as you enter a new consumer segment. But all of those assume that you're operating within the legislative grounds of the current market you're in. As soon as you go over one province, it changes a little, and another province it changes a little more. And so not only are you testing different consumer segments, but you're also testing your ability to be compliant on packaging, for example, in Quebec versus Nova Scotia, which have very different laws. But the reason it is easier to do that in Canada than internationally is because at least as one federal place, one federal sandbox, if you will, 60% of the legislation applies to all the provinces versus you ship to Europe or to the US, and suddenly the whole thing changes 180 degrees on its head. So there's a compliance piece that's simpler. There's a logistics piece that's simpler. There's a consumer segment piece that's simpler. And one of our investors likes to say, you should choose export markets based on where your friends are. So if you've got buddies in Alberta, let's say 50 of them from working there in the oil fields back in the day, they make a pretty good first run that you can literally text message and say, just got my product into these stores. Would you mind buying some for me so that we create that initial velocity in the market? And you'd be surprised how many friends you have who will happily come to support you, depending on where they live and in what province.
I love that. In entrepreneurship, we're so frequently talking about how your friends and your family are your first investors, right? And your first funders, but also seeing them as your first connections, possibly to scale your business is a great way of looking at that too, right? Look at your inner circle, scroll through your phone contacts to see,
Totally.
where you can be supported.
And where the
To
federal, sorry to interrupt,
No, no,
Amanda,
go
but
for it, please.
a quick anecdote. When the recent federal announcement about, or the Ontario Nova Scotia liquor legislation was announced, I couldn't tell you the amount of buddies from companies I've worked at, college buddies I haven't spoken to in 20 years, who immediately texted, WhatsApp, Facebook Message, whatever, saying, how and when do I get this? And these are people I have not done a good job keeping in touch with. So truly having a market of people as your kind of proving ground is very handy.
Nice. I
Yeah,
love that.
Amanda, if I might add
Yeah.
something real quick, and that is just to jump onto Josh and what he's saying. When I work with clients, I very often use the onion and the layers of the onion, right? And it is super important because in the question that you actually ask, Amanda, there's something that kind of put a an error mode in my brain, and that was early start and scale, right? Early stage and scale. And I think, in all honesty, we see very, very rarely a company that goes from early stage to scaling within a quick time period. And it's you just gotta put the time in. You gotta go to the farmer's market, to the first store in your town, dominate, dominate your local area first, and then inch outwards towards the next valley, the next town, and whatnot, right? Because it will provide you with the repeat orders, the cash flow, the profitability. Dominate first your local market and then inch outwards. But I do want to also say there's a significant reality that impacts what we are talking here in a dramatic fashion. Narissa and I, we're in British Columbia. Um, you can drive your product from Vancouver to Calgary, and it'll take you on the truck about 14 hours. In that same time period, the truck has not only unloaded products in Seattle after a 3.5 hour drive, but also it has reached Seattle, Portland, Oregon after seven and a half hours drive. So we live in a vast country where geography and logistics availability, especially a discrepancy in rural areas, access to cheap logistics plays a huge role as to where you can go.
Mhm.
So that needs to be factored in.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a great call out. Um, and yeah, I'm seeing Kathy in the chat saying that she's loving your recommendation of dominate your own market. I mean, I think that's phenomenal advice. We get so excited, right, with a new business idea, then you just want to grow and you just want to scale. But see your homegrown success first. And building off of that, Michael, when you see that when dominate your hometown market or where you are first and you are ready to start expanding, why is it helpful to treat interprovincial trade with the same rigor as international trade?
Yeah, I love the word rigor. It's one of the more underused words in growing businesses. Sometimes, anyway. Maybe I'm unfair here. Listen, it is crucial. It is absolutely crucial, I believe, and my experience has shown, and I can show you all the scars in my bank account as well as on my body on expensive mistakes of underestimating any market. Any market. Like you go, no, I should back up here for a second. I think right now it is incredibly, incredibly exciting to be an entrepreneur because everything that Ryan is talking about and he's working on with all the colleagues across the provinces and territories are allowing us to have an easier way of conducting business in the future. So far, your research into going to a different province had to involve many, many, many different things. And Narissa represents agri-food, and so does Josh. And they know a song or two to sing about all the varying degrees of what you need to get ready for with certifications, regulatory affairs, safety plans, safe food for Canadian, you name it. It's a long list, right? And so it's really, and labeling comes on top of that, and then finding partners and doing your homework early on is crucial because at the end of the day, the piper wants to be paid no matter what. And that means you got to spend the money and the time and the resources to find it out. But imagine if you do that in the beginning and you're de-risking your scaling effort and making it easier. But imagine then, in contrast, you don't, and you ship things to a market within Canada that doesn't like it. There's French missing. There's labeling wrong. There's some sort of situation. I give you an example. One of my clients deals with pressure equipment, air compressors. And Canada has a technical system called Canadian Registration Number on top of an existing internationally recognized technical standard, ASME. And so there's so much complexity. And if they don't understand what provinces they can go to with the initial design, um, or not, they would have to, shipments get refused. A technical inspection suddenly shows that this finished product for many hundreds of thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars is not admissible to the province. That is expensive, getting it back, refitting it, the loss of face. Just imagine losing the risk of reputation, right? Because every client expects that you, as the seller, understand what you're in business for and how to meet the regulatory environment of the consumer's marketplace.
And the
Mhm.
requirements of the buyer as well, which
And so on.
sometimes we don't think of. We ship the product to four different provinces, and the single buyer there, the liquor corporations, and all those four all operate the same way. And then we enter province number five, and it turns out there's a very particular type of cardboard box that they need the product in that somehow we missed in our process, and they just ship all those heavy pallets of carbonated liquid back across the country for you to re-put into different cardboard boxes to ship back. Not only an expensive mistake, an incredibly wasteful and embarrassing one to have in your portfolio.
Yeah, Josh, I really saw you nodding along as Michael was talking there. So I had a feeling that, you had experience with this. And so I would love if we could like dive a little bit deeper on that and your journey with Good Robot, but then also, becoming a beverage manufacturing company as well. So Good Robot went from a single brew pub to three venues, a wholesale brand, and a co-packing facility. Um, so what was that moment that you realized you needed to stop thinking like just like not just, but like a brew pub owner and start thinking like a manufacturer and see that you had something there, to work nationally and do some business to business scaling?
Totally. And just before I forget, because I have the memory of a goldfish, Michael's point about dominating your market, our rule of thumb, which we borrowed from Dr. James Richardson, who's an anthropologist turned consumer packaged goods marketer, has a book called Ramping Your Brand. And if you're in CPG, it's a must read. But his rule of thumb was if you're not doing $250,000 per SKU in your local market, don't even think about exporting one state or one province over. So, we like to try to hit half a mil before we think about New Brunswick, for example. Um, the moment was the moment where the whole world had a decision to make, and it was COVID for us. Uh, we had a brew pub. It was forcibly shut down. We lost all our employees, and we went to $0 revenue overnight. And that happened again in the autumn that year, forcibly shut down by law. So we realized the tumultuousness of hospitality and the importance of the at-home experience of beer and other beverages. And so we leaned into e-commerce and wholesale and borrowed a bunch of money to do it right, to hire good salespeople. And suddenly, we were doing more volume out of our little brewery than we ever were before. And there's this slogan that's painted in our original brew pub location that says, "I don't want to grow up," which was something that one of us had said to the media early on. And it was kind of I think the way we felt about quitting our engineering careers and opening a bar with our buddies. But suddenly, when we had massive demands, when we had employees whose jobs were in tumultuousness due to the market, when we had investors whose dollars were tumultuous due to the market, when we had GDP that was terrible risk, economic risk because of COVID, of the resourcing it would take to get out of that. And uh, Frank McKenna, former premier of New Brunswick, had this light a fire under your ass speech that he gave to entrepreneurs in Atlantic Canada, where he said, government's going to administer the plan to dig us out of this hole, but business is going to pay for it. So if you're not growing your business right now, you have a responsibility to, because we need those dollars. And for me, that was the moment of, okay, we're not just a little quirky brew pub anymore. We got to scale this thing. We've got a product that people want. And in order to make that product consistently available at a good quality, we needed to 10x our capacity and also 10x our consistency and quality. And as we went through that exercise, we realized we're not the only ones in this pool. Uh, we recognized that there was no dedicated alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverage co-packing facility that could service the expansion needs of the other breweries, wineries, farms, distilleries, cideries, stores, restaurants, energy drink companies, whatever, who needed extra production capacity or the compliance to sell at Costco and whatnot. And since it didn't exist, we decided to borrow that money and take the risk on behalf of those what would become 28 future clients. So I think there was a fire moment when the world was changing that kind of shifted our mindset a bit, and now there's no turning back. This is the reality now. We got to keep going.
That's great. And I love the testament to like, you got to stay on your toes as a business owner, right? And as an entrepreneur, you never know that a global pandemic is on its way and you're gonna have to, shift your business. Now, Narissa and Michael, for yourselves who work in, consulting for businesses in Canada, what do you see at what point in a business's growth should they start thinking about looking into provincial regulatory differences, start that research as to if they should uh expand, because of course that takes a lot of time, and in entrepreneurship, time is money. And, so when should they actually start looking at different provinces for expansion?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's one that, it's different for every entrepreneur. But I think honestly earlier than they think. So I think the moment a business is even considering shipping outside of their home province, whether it's direct to consumer or through a distributor, that's the time to really map out the differences in labeling or health authority oversight or container type, as Josh mentioned, the markups, testing requirements, all of those things, right? We know that, trade reforms are good, but provinces maintain substantial regulatory variation, especially in alcohol and food, the space I'm in. So my rule, before your second province becomes a revenue line in your forecast, do a compliance gap assessment. It saves founders from costly reprints, from relabeling, from shipments that are being held later. And it's really not that difficult to do. Like you said, we're entrepreneurs and we're busy, but you need to take the time to do it. So it's simple. Start with mapping your federal requirements and use that as your baseline, right? Licensing, preventative controls, traceability, labeling under the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. This forms the core compliance framework that applies across Canada, and then identify the provincial layer that you want to enter into. Pull in those provincial requirements. Ontario, for example, requires mandatory certified food handler on shift, every shift for every hour, inspection posting and record keeping, whereas BC, where I'm in, mandatory food safety plans and sanitation plans and food safe recognized training. Those are all, so there are different requirements for each of the provinces. And once you then identify the provincial layer that you want to move into, then compare your current system with that provincial expectation and ask yourself, do my SOPs meet the new province's expectations? Does my team's food handler certification meet their provincial standard? So Ontario versus BC's food safe. Do my facility plans have to be resubmitted? Do I need additional logs or approvals or plan reviews? Because every every province will have slight variations, and a federally compliant producer in Ontario still needs to meet BC's mandated food safety plan and sanitation plan before getting a permit, and then just close that gap. So that just means updating your documentation. It might mean retraining your staff, using the province's recognized training program, or submitting plans to the local health authority for approval. Yeah, but all of these things are essential if you are thinking about, and when you start to think about crossing the provincial lines.
In all honesty, Narissa said it so beautifully. I don't add another thing to take away from what you just said. It was amazing.
I love that. As Nursa was talking, I was like, wow, this is exactly who I'd want to talk to. This is exactly who I'd be calling if I were in that position. Um, Narissa, I'm gonna come back to you for a further question, because you come from a unique perspective of course, this your background and your careers in food safety, but then you shifted from a 20-year government career to co-found your consulting business and then Black Business Association of BC, and with your food safety consulting on top of that. How does this combination of entrepreneurship and regulatory experience inform you on how you support business owners? As someone who's very inspired by the way you're talking.
You know what? I think it really grounds how I deliver advice and support to businesses. I think what CFIA taught me is how regulators think, how they assess risk assessments to work, what triggers enforcement action. And as an entrepreneur, I translate that into practical business-friendly systems. So CFIA is built on preventative control plans, on licensing, on traceability, on scientifically grounded oversight. So when I work with a business, I don't approach it from, I don't approach compliance as a burdensome checklist. I frame it more as, this is your speed to get to the shelf. This is showcasing buyer confidence in your product and risk reduction. So a strong preventative control plan and traceability, even though that's satisfying CFIA requirements, they prevent recalls and unlock growth for your business. So having lived inside the system and now supporting businesses outside it, I help founders, avoid traps that I saw repeatedly while I was working for the CFIA, especially around, things like incomplete preventative control plans, weak documentation, and assumptions that one province's rules work everywhere. And now that the government is adopting digital and AI tools, I also help businesses digitize their operations because honestly, by 2030, if you are not digitally sound, it will not be easy to do business in the food, plant, and animal space. And then other things like a good preventive control plan that forces you to structure your supplier verification. So under federal food safety systems, businesses have to verify incoming ingredients and packaging and materials they come from safe and approved compliant suppliers. So this means founders don't choose suppliers based on price alone. You've got to look at them based on risk, documentation, performance, all of those things, right? A good preventive control plan, it can help you eliminate that shadow risk in the supply chain. It strengthens your negotiating powers because you know exactly what you require, the specifications, the testing, the handling, the temper controls, all of those things. So you're negotiating from a position of strength, not vulnerability. And, it just, all in all of that helps for interprovincial scaling. So as soon as a company, enters a new province, inconsistent provincial rules make supply chain quality even more important. So, yeah, that's really just how I lead. It's helping to understand the web of legislation that surrounds food, but it's using that as the support to build your business into one that is strong under legislation, but it's strong because it's helping you to scale.
Thank you. Michael, did you have something to add? I saw you raise your hand there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amanda. The one thing I did want to add is it is incredibly tempting as an audience, whoever is on the call listening to this discussion, to discard what Narissa just said because they may not be in a food environment, agri-food, agriculture environment. But I caution you really with the fact that everything and anything she said may be for agri-food. However, quality assurance, debugging, all these things she said with slight changes in wording apply to all of us, no matter what the sector, no matter what the industry, no matter what the product, no matter what the service. So please heat some yeah, just attention to what Narissa just said, no matter what your product or service is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all of this advice, it's interchangeable, right? You might not have a food business yourself, but everything Narissa is saying can be relevant for any type of business. Now, speaking of, regulations and actually starting to trade internationally, we would be silly to have this webinar and not talk about Bill C5. So Ryan, Bill C5, the One Canadian Economy Act, it received royal assent in June 2025. What does it actually change on the ground for Canadian businesses trying to sell across provincial lines?
Sure. Thanks for the question. The Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act was passed, I believe, in June and implemented in January 1st of this year. My team had a big role to play on that, so we're happy to promote it any chance we get. So the act removes federal barriers to movement of goods, services, and labor within Canada, really by recognizing provincial and territorial requirements while still protecting the health and safety and economic well-beings of Canadians and the environment. So many provinces and territories have passed similar laws. And so the government of Canada wanted to do its part to leverage this idea of recognizing other governments' rules to remove barriers to trade in Canada. And so in preparing the legislation, it became clear that there are few federal barriers to interprovincial trade. We only uncovered a handful that restrict the movement of of goods, services, or workers across provincial and territorial borders. So the economic impact is a little limited, but it does create some real improvements for Canadians that I can tell you about. It enables trade of energy-using products, so appliances like washing machines, HVAC equipment, lighting products, a whole range of products. And it does so by ensuring that products that meet provincial standards on energy efficiency that are comparable to federal standards, they can be shipped across Canada as if they meet the federal standard. So trying to eliminate, that extra layer of red tape and compliance. It also facilitates labor mobility for select professions. The federal government doesn't regulate a lot of them, but we do regulate land surveyors and some occupations in the rail sector, like locomotive engineers. It simply makes it easier to get a federal license once you already have a provincial license. And so, there's been a 40% increase in land surveyor applications for a federal license since we passed the act. So we like to think that, we're really making things easier in that occupation. And given the focus on food, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention there is an exception to our act in the food sector for food safety rules. We consulted 200 stakeholders in developing the act, and we heard most consistently from the food sector concerns that, recognizing provincial food systems would take away from the federal food safety system, which is the most comprehensive in Canada, but also potentially impact exports, might risk trading partners losing some trust in Canada's food system. And that trust is really important to ensuring our exports. So food is exempted from the act. And that's what it does.
Thanks. Thanks so much for breaking that down. I think, understanding a bill sometimes can feel a little intimidating to an entrepreneur or a small business owner. So I appreciate you talking us through that. Kathy in the chat has a question that is very similar to the one that I'm about to ask. So it's great that we're on the same in wavelength. Michael and Narissa, with this new legislation, what do you think what do you think a truly national market now looks like as an opportunity, but also what is still standing in the way?
From my perspective, I'm not going to talk about agri-food because Ryan just mentioned that, as well as Narissa being an expert in that. I think it's the Canadian Mutual Recognition Agreement, which at this point in time hasn't been implemented by all. I think June this year is the deadline, but it offers definitely an opportunity for smoother sailing across provinces. I did mention before one of the clients that I'm working with that has still enormous difficulties, despite the fact that this mutual recognition agreement despite the fact that there was a previous law passed in 2020 that makes it easier for design reviews of such installations to be mutually recognized in BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. What I see still as a barrier, and maybe Ryan takes note of that, is that there are local inspectors, let's call them, that haven't read the memo yet, perhaps, and still apply rules from past days as an act of defiance, perhaps, to allow that free trade to happen. In general, I applaud the effort. I applaud the activities from all the negotiation partners. But in a way, I'm still waiting to see what happens. I was on a presentation route 2 weeks ago in BC talking about interprovincial barriers, and I find businesses, especially in rural areas, have a real hard time understanding what's different now for me. So that's just to highlight that we have come a far way. There's still a far way to go, but it also needs to trickle down into everyday dealings at all levels.
You know what? I mirror what Michael is saying because, these bills are going to open doors. They're opening doors for better trade. As a consultant, it's very clear to me that the information is not trickling down from that federal level to the businesses that need to know the information, but it's also not trickling down to the inspectors that enforce the legislation. So we're having issues with interpretations of legislation and it being enforced one way at this office and another way at another office. And so I think great headway for for the government to take notice and hear the feedback from industry in terms of the issues that could be faced, and then enacting um, exemptions to allow to make things easier for the movement of product. I think at this point, awareness is really crucial. A campaign so that not just the businesses and the stakeholders are aware, but the enforcers of the legislation are aware and have access to information that can allow them to make the correct decisions when they're dealing with businesses, because an error in a decision from a regulator can be costly to a business, and they cannot afford. Most businesses are small businesses; they cannot afford costly mistakes. So, I think that's where there's room for improvement, and there's room for learning. Is how can we help even as service providers help disseminate this information out so that everyone is on the industry side and the business side is aware, and then how can the government help to ensure that inspectors are aware.
Thank you. Yeah, Ryan, did you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful feedback, and I think between us, like government is always trying to communicate better and translate what is like, we really specialize in like technical and legal information, and trying to make that accessible to, especially to small businesses who may not have a lot of regulatory sort of compliance tools. So for the Free Trade and Labor Mobility Act, we published a user guide. I can share a link afterwards that we tried to make really clear about at least like what was covered, what was not covered, and we specifically consulted, I think, with the and I think that there isn't a similar document for the Canadian Mutual Recognition Agreement yet, and I think it just has 14 governments instead of one, and so we're doing our best to also communicate like what that agreement does, because it's important.
Yeah, Narissa.
I just want to make a really quick recommendation to Ryan in that, and the way the government communicates to industry sh shouldn't always look the same in terms of, for example, if you send out a publication saying this is what this means, sometimes you have to get down and dirty in with businesses so that they understand. So, for small businesses in the Black community, a hands-on workshop far exceeds just sending out like a publicized memo. So I think it would be most impactful to look at who you're trying to get information out to, and understand that there are different ways to disseminate information for the best understanding of all the industry players. And we would be, and I know most service providers would be happy to assist in helping the government to disseminate information because it helps everyone.
Thanks for that, Narissa. I think that's a great call out. Now, Michael, we've talked about, the importance of, you know, growing in your home base first, and the importance of considering scaling nationally before internationally. Um, but I'm curious how, maybe beyond what we've already touched on about, making sure you're dominating your local market, how do you determine that, as someone who's consulting, that a business is ready to expand beyond their home province? What are the green lights you look for? Is there a checklist or a revenue threshold, a mindset shift like that, that a business is truly prepared to take that on?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, Amanda. It's uh I would say roughly speaking now, what would help to look at from my perspective are three things: operational, financial, and mindset. And I'm just going to quickly, just tease a little bit into these three. So, operationally, I mean, there has to be an ability to meet consistent quality delivery targets, at whatever level that business is at, whether it's, local, regional, provincial, it doesn't matter. But the ability to do these things consistently without wavering, there will always be something that goes sideways, always. But that should be, let's say, the acceptance, not the norm, right? Having the supply chain figured out with some regularity, understanding what some choices could be to substitute. We live in an incredibly dynamic trade time these days with tariffs flying back and forth everywhere, new free trade agreements coming on board. So there's literally every single day new doors opening, whether it's to ship out, to export, or to import, right? And that's fantastic. So that's one. And also operationally to be able to scale, meaning produce higher volumes, being equipped to do that. Financially, the second one that I mentioned is really where's the cash flow at? Where are the margins at? Is the pricing figured out to the point that you're not giving up money, not leaving money on the table if you go elsewhere? It's not that bigger is better. It's not more distant is better. It's, are you able to remain consistently profitable and even be able to expand your profitability in whatever market you are, from farmers market all the way to delivering something to South Africa or Australia? It doesn't matter. So that is really, really important. But also the payment terms, payment risks, compliance costs, certification spending, you name it, right? And Josh already talked about EDC. EDC is a formidable partner. And so there's ways there. Oh, on the financial side also, I really, really need to stress what I very often insist on early on is that there's really, really good relationships with lenders way in advance. So even before you need money, build relationships, because if you need money, today, tomorrow, next week, it's not going to come from anywhere because there's just too many hurdles, too many questions asked these days, from lenders. So that's super important. And ultimately, and perhaps I would argue most importantly, is mindset. In my intro, I mentioned that I've worked with about 250 plus companies so far in this capacity. And I can tell you the biggest game maker or game breaker is mindset. If somebody is comfortable within a certain revenue scale, within a certain complexity of life, offering opportunities, that's great. That's not going to be the exporter of the year of 2027 or 2028, right? Because it does take tenacity. It does take to have a beginner's mindset, a learner's mindset. It requires ambition. It requires an ability to create networks, to learn not just client networks, but also like-minded people, right? Other companies owners. I would argue that entrepreneurs are some of the most lonely people on the planet. They are so hyper focused, they are on a mission, but very often what falls by the wayside is relationships. And so very, very often I just urge people to join a president's club, or CME, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, has these peer council groups, all those kind of things. Super important. So those are the three.
Thank you for sharing that, Michael. That's really great advice. And there's actually a meme online right now about how people saying like, "Oh, I started my own business because, I wanted to be my own boss and now all I do is work." And, so I think it's really, really important to tap into those communities, right? And to know that there's resources for you. Um, I to build off of, those green flags you shared, Josh, as someone who maybe started to see some of those green flags and you did decide to expand nationally. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Good Robot has distributed to 5 provinces now.
Mhm.
What was the biggest surprise about scaling beer distribution across Canada? And also, can you share a specific instance where interprovincial expansion maybe didn't go as planned and what it taught you?
Yeah, we are re-entering Alberta. Whoops, dropped my mic. Excuse me one sec. Yeah, we are re-entering Alberta, and the reason we're re-entering was that our first entrance didn't go so hot. We had a distribution partner there that had massive changeover going on in their organization over a period of year and a half. They weren't able to navigate the targets we were looking for, and we stepped into the market a little kind of half cocked, and we retreated because it was bleeding money, and we just didn't have the proper marketing and sales plan in place. It was one of those uh, chasing a butterfly situations. You look at an export market and you go, "Ooh, revenue," and every entrepreneur loves the shiny object, right? Um, so we're back there, and this time we've got a plan. So that was a hard lesson learned. Um, on the compliance side of things, I see that Maureen from Navigate Food Safety is on the line, and they helped us with our HACCP and food safety and basically quality control systems and training for our employees to make sure that every batch of alcoholic or non-alcoholic beverages we're producing is consistent, they're traceable, they could be sold to Superstore, Walmart, Costco, Amazon, doesn't matter. And before we went through that, we entered British Columbia through the Costco Advent calendar, one of those Advent calendars where they've got a different beer for every day of Advent. And it happened that the product we shipped, our entry into that market, was with a product that ended up with a contamination issue uh, and was turned a little bit sour. Certainly not harmful, but just wasn't exactly to the quality standard that we have now. And so our market entrance into British Columbia was hundreds of people leaving us 2 and 3 star and 1 star reviews on untapped.com, which is the world's largest beer social media site. And that was a fun and hard lesson learned. And we ended up turning it into a positive story by being exceedingly generous with those customers and offering them all $50 gift cards. But that was another situation where our bullishness in approaching income ended up biting us in the ass because we didn't have the necessary building blocks before that. So those compliance pieces, to Narissa's point, are not only good for your company to produce a consistent product, but also they are excellent sales tools. When you're selling to those markets, when you're selling to founders of distribution companies or whatever, when you have those pieces and you include them in your presentation, you can watch the operator types in the room really respond to that. And they start singing your praises and repeating it back to you. So we've had a few hard lessons learned, certainly. And Michael tapped into some interesting. Virtually every sentence he was saying was triggering another memory of ours. The mental mindset, I just want to talk about a little bit. Um, my psychologist, Dr. Conrad, believes that there are 3 prerequisites that every individual, as well as groups of people, require in order to be ready to change. One of those is an external circumstance change. So something like COVID or a tariff being introduced will put us into a state of change. The second piece is the individual's desire to change, which is sort of out of external control. That's simply a what was the word earlier? Was it grit we were saying, or nerve?
Rigor, I believe.
Rigor. Yes, that is a degree of rigor or tenacity that rests with the individual. But the third piece that we often don't talk about is support. And a lot of the topics on the call have surrounded, walking together, not being alone. There are government agencies, there are forums, there are founder groups. In Atlantic Canada, we've got Wallace McCain Institute, as well as Entrepreneur Organization. Places that you can go to find other people who are going through or have been through the same thing you're going through. And you might have friends and family and lovers and all that. But when you're doing something that nobody around you has done before, it becomes lonely and frightening to the power of 10. So I'd say in order to facilitate export and facilitate that mindset, it's good to find a good support system.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I'll take this moment to plug that Startup Canada. We do tour across Canada. We're going to be coming to Halifax very soon, so we'll get to see you in person, Josh. And we're going to Victoria and Mississauga this year, and those are great opportunities to, build your community and meet other entrepreneurs in the space. So if anyone here is joining from any of those areas, we'd love to see you in person and help you create those connections and those networks. Now we are approaching a little bit of our end of time, and I want to make sure we get to some of the Q&A questions, but I also really want to touch on a really big shift we've seen in the Canadian market over the past year, and that is so with Canada's recent removal of interprovincial trade barriers. This is partly a response to U.S. tariff pressure. We've seen a really big buy Canadian moment. For any of our panelists today, how long do you think that window of domestic opportunity stays open, and should businesses be sprinting to take advantage of it right now?
Oh, I'm so excited about that because I mean, what are you waiting for? Like Canada is here. It's been here since 1867. Do trade across Canada. We already talked about it. It has the same flag, it has the same currency, it has the same legal system. All that's apart is okay, peek into understanding what the regulatory situation is and figure out the logistics. Like don't wait. And of course, I've said before, dominate the local market. Make sure that the cash cow is grazing and is getting fatter on the meadow. Um, on the local meadow before you go to the next steps and start spending money. That is important. But while that is the case, travel to, I don't know, a convention in Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver or wherever it is across the country for you and familiarize yourself with the market, with the industry at a large trade show convention, rub shoulders, shake hands, go to some of these informative sessions that are there as a visitor first, paying $400 for the ticket and not paying $10,000 for the 10 by 10 booth kind of thing in the first year. So do that. Don't wait. Don't wait with at least getting educated, I would say.
Yeah, I love that, Michael, because um, like you said, what are we waiting for? So it's a genuine moment. It's not a blank check, obviously. But the window stays open as long as provinces continue implementing reforms, and they are. So the opportunity is there. And I would just say, don't sprint blindly. Have a disciplined sprint. Strengthen your supply chain, standardize your compliance package, please. I'll always say standardize compliance package. Build your regional distribution relationships and lock in your cost before volatility returns, right? So move fast, but only as fast as your quality, your cash flow, and your capacity can sustain. And one thing I always say when people are looking to export out of Canada is you have to visit an export market. to understand what that market is, to walk the floor of the shelves of the markets where you plan to have your product. Look at, the would your product compete? Could your packaging compete? Is it what people even want in that country? It's the same thing as what Michael just said. You've got to, if you're in BC and you plan to put your product in Montreal, then you got to go to Montreal. You have to go where you plan to sell your product and explore and research that market to see if it is a fit for your product. But definitely the window is open and there's no reason for you to not explore and look into and research expanding across Canada.
I'm just gonna add on to what you were saying, Nursa, about researching and making sure there's the need where you want to expand. This is we had a webinar last year, and we had a representative from Dan Stainless, and they were talking about exporting nationally, oh, sorry, internationally. And they do a lot of stainless steel lunch boxes, and they tried to expand to France, and it was really not working for them. Only to discover that you don't bring your lunch to work in France. And so, right, there's like that importance of doing your research is incredibly important. And something that needs to be top of mind when you're looking to expand. Um, I just wanted to nail that in because I've never forgotten that story about, oh, right, like such a simple thing. Like some people don't, it's not common to bring your lunch to work in France can be a make or break on whether or not you have success in scaling in an area. Yeah, Michael.
Product adaptation is the name of the game here. If you put a 375 milliliter wine bottle in there, it may actually work
Mm.
in France.
Yeah, Ryan. Oh, I think Ryan might be frozen. Is that just for me?
He is frozen.
I think he's muted now.
Sorry, Ryan, we can't hear you. Okay, I'm going to. Uh, okay, well, while Ryan microphone solves itself, I'm going to move on to some of our Q&A questions that we have here. So these can be answered by anyone in the room, unless there's, specified for someone, but even if they are, if anyone has anything they want to add, please feel free to jump on. Our first question is actually specifically for Joshua from Lisa. Do you manufacture your cans and lids, and how is that working with the current U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs? Now, this is specifically, about your business, but I'd love if anyone could expand on um, how, the U.S. tariffs have what they've seen in Canadian business and it, how that has changed manufacturing.
Short answer, no and nightmare. Uh, there isn't in Canada an aluminum can or lid manufacturing facility. I think Canadians are having a rude awakening to how little manufacturing we do as a country, considering we're a G8 country. And we do a lot of niche stuff like advanced manufacturing, we do very well. But something like aluminum cans, we take the aluminum ore from Quebec, we send it down to Pennsylvania, they turn it into cans, they send it back to us, we fill the cans. Now, that's a matter of time, probably in the next year and a half or two, before there is a 9 or 10 figure investment into an aluminum can and lid processing facility, likely in Ontario. But in the interim, those aluminum cans are coming from the US, they're coming from Asia, they're coming from the Middle East, especially a lot of the small premium, the little aluminum cans for wine, for example, or certain European sparkling water. Dubai is big on those. So aluminum per ton basically overnight tripled, and it's insane how the impact of that. So what happens to that as a manufacturer is you end up eating those costs. because you can't price shock your clients when you have an enterprise business with $500,000 or $1 million contracts to produce. You can't just suddenly offload all those costs and the margin markup at the same time on your clients. They have a field day. So you end up eating it a little bit to preserve your client's cash flow, and you become a kind of a form of bank, really. So the situation, whether it's you know even before the tariffs, there's been a global supply chain crisis for about 3 years, and we can see how fickle it is when we aren't able to domestically produce stuff. So regionalized supply chains are certainly of interest to food, beverage, and other consumer packaged goods processors like ourselves. Um, and yeah, it's just throw it on the pile of problems you deal with on a day-to-day, week-to-week challenge as an entrepreneur.
Thanks for answering that, Josh. Um, Ryan, we did lose you briefly when you were answering the question before about the Buy Canadian moment. Did you want to? I think it looks like maybe you're back with us. Did you want to pick up on what you were saying? Sorry about that. Oh, oh, we still don't have your audio. Sorry, Ryan. Technology, love it. All right. In the meantime, a question from Kathy is, I love this one. How do we do a better job in promotion of entrepreneurship supports available to startups and established businesses? How do we best get the entrepreneurs' attention? As Michael mentioned, their heads are down in their business, which means they may come up for help only when they are in crisis, which is unfortunate, when we are wanting and able to help one another. So yeah, I think that's a great question from the perspective of people in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. How can we do a better job communicating to entrepreneurs that these resources exist?
If I may take a kick
Yeah,
at the Pennsylvania can. Um, I it's interesting. There was a time when there was a movement of consolidation in government and government programs to urban areas. And you call this 1-800 number or you email this email address, and then we'll help you. And I think over the last 5 to 10 years, there has been a movement away from that and the recognition that the boots on the ground, the people in the communities, the business after business events, all those kind of things have enormous value. And I know Startup Canada is doing a great job. I know you even had a a little what you call it chapter in Nelson, BC, some time ago. We BC, Women's Enterprise BC, and the equivalent on a national level. And there's so many organizations, Startup Canada, Futurepreneur, and so forth and so on. They all understand they need to go out in the communities and meet the entrepreneurs where they are, organize events, and that's where the magic happens. And the multiplier effect is such that if there's one, two, three, 10 satisfied clients, word of mouth spreads, and suddenly, it really works for those that do want to engage with these kind of services. So that would be my 5 cents here.
Great. Thank you. All
I'll
right,
pick
we
it up
are.
if,
Oh,
uh, no, if we're out of time, I'm happy to cut them out.
no, no, it's okay. I just really want to get to this. I think Ryan's
Or-
mic is back, and so I just really want to get to this very
Can you
last
hear me?
question.
Can you
Yes,
hear
awesome.
Hey,
me?
About
Is it good? Oh, now I think it's frozen.
oh,
Can you hear me?
okay. Well, you
We
know
can hear
what?
you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. All right. I just wanted to address a couple comments in the chat about what Canada or what federal government is doing to expand interprovincial trade of food in Canada. So there's actually a lot of work underway, which I wanted to talk to you about because I know there's a lot of interest. So CFIA, the Food Inspection Agency, are investing it's called a concierge service, basically personalized guidance to businesses interested in getting a federal food safety license. And they've also created an internal trade hub where businesses can get like more and clearer information on how to trade interprovincially and how to get the food safety license. And they're also advancing an exciting pilot project with Ontario and Quebec to increase access to slaughterhouses under provincial oversight in underserved and border regions. And they're also exploring a more permanent solution to try and scale up some of these things to make sure that we keep a high level of food safety. So there's a lot of work underway. I just wanted to speak to that a bit.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for adding that. Narissa.
Yeah, and quickly, thanks, Ren. I noticed in I think it was Lisa's question, she asked about why interprovincial movement can affect international agreements. And I just wanted to just say, you know, as a country, every country that has a food regulatory body, is part of an international body as well, right? And we follow guidelines under things like the World Health Organization and various other international bodies, which allows us to be able to trade with other countries and vice versa. So if we don't have a strong regulatory system in Canada that we can prove works and creates safe food, then we cannot then enter into trade agreements internationally. So that's why interprovincial movement policies, or even that's why the policies you see that CFIA creates and Health Canada creates, it's because we have to be able to showcase that we have strong legislation to ensure that we are producing safe food. So countries that can't, they're cannot enter into international agreements with other countries. So we have a lot of countries that cannot import into Canada high risk products like meats and things like that. There's a handful of countries that can import certain high risk things. We can export meats and so forth because we do have a strong regulatory framework, and that's why interprovincial policies affect international agreements.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think that is a phenomenal way or a great note to end on in just understanding how your interprovincial trade will ultimately affect your national scale. Thank you all so much for staying with us for 2 minutes longer. We really appreciate you joining us for today's event. We have a quick feedback poll that we're going to launch now to learn how your experience was today. I would like to take a moment to give a very, very big thank you to our speakers, Joshua, Michael, Narissa, and Ryan, for donating your time and expertise. We packed a lot into an hour and a half, so thank you so much. And thank you again to our co-presenting partners, UPS and Export Development Canada, as well as our ecosystem partners, Forum for International Trade Training, and our community partners, GS1, Communitech, and WeBC. Our next Startup Global event is an industry roundtable on healthcare, which will be taking place on April 9th. So we'll drop the registration link for that if that is your industry or your interest in the chat. So make sure you register if you're interested in attending, and visit Startup Canada on tour. We are going to be in Halifax on April 29th, Victoria on September 29th, and Mississauga October 29th. So 29th, remember that. We might be in your city. Thank you so much for joining us, and take care, everyone.